Join me as I dive into a heated debate. Is individualism helping or hurting students? I'll look at both sides to see what I find. So imagine you're 12 years old. You've been in school for 6 years already, and you've barely passed. No matter what you do, school is just really hard for you. And you failed at your last school, which was a public school. So your parents took you and they put you in an elite private school. And in some ways it's easier to pass, but you're still confused all the time. And worse than that, you're bullied all the time. People will look at you and they'll run away and scream to bully you. The other classmates are very rude. They don't understand what's going on. Your parents don't understand what's going on. And life is just really, really hard for you. You feel really isolated. You're not really learning a lot. You don't understand what's going on. And so this just really takes a toll on your mental health. You start to self-harm. So you start to pick at your fingernails so much they bleed. And you don't have much fingernails left because you picked at them so much. You also start cutting yourself, which is something that you do just because there's so much pain involved with your life that you don't know what to do and you don't feel like you have a future. And your parents and your grandparents sometimes fuss at you because you're just not doing well at school and they don't know what's going to happen to you. Life is just really hard. Now, imagine you're 6 years old and there's a student in your class who is constantly violent, throw things, curse. They are very, very rude towards the teacher, who is a young teacher who's just doing her best. And for a while, a parent actually has to stay with this student. The student still is violent towards the parent, even though the parent's right there. But the parent ends up leaving. The child no longer has the parent with them, and the behaviors are just worse. One day, the student breaks your teacher's phone right in front of you, which to you is a very disrespectful thing. It's very loud. And the meltdown that follows that is really loud and it's scary to you. But that student comes back to school because that student has a disability and your parents reached out to complain that this was harming you, having this student in your class. You can't concentrate, you can't do work, and it's also just really mentally hard on you to constantly have this conflict. The school says, well, this child has a disability, so he has to stay in this class. And then one day in the afternoon, the child shoots your teacher in front of you, 6 years old, and you just witnessed a major shooting, a major traumatic event that you will stay with you the rest of your life. Which of these is better? The answer is they're both bad, of course. They're both negative. And what I just described was two extremes of culture. So the first example I described is something that is a composite. It's made up of different things I saw and I heard about when I lived in China, because I had lots of international teacher friends. In China, it's very communalistic. So that means that children are seen as belonging to families, but not little families, but extended families, and belonging to communities and nations at large. And decisions are made based on what's right for the population at large. And if you think about it, China has a huge population. It's got down to number 2 now, but it used to be number 1. So it kind of has to be that way, especially in education when you're trying to teach so many children. And in China, learning differences or learning disabilities or even just individual differences in students is not really recognized, particularly in public schools. A lot of parents are now putting their children in private schools because they tend to be better with that. And some private schools have like Western education or they have special programs. But generally speaking, China is a very communalistic society. And when it comes to disabilities, many times those are not even recognized unless they're obvious or they're physical. So for example, if a child can't walk or a child is blind, that's obvious as being a disability. And traditionally, those children did not receive an education even until just a few years ago. That's starting to change. They're starting to have special education programs in China. But again, those are usually just for physically disabled children who are very severely disabled. So if a child struggles because of an intellectual delay or something like autism, which occurs worldwide, then that child will just probably be in a regular class and will struggle, and that child may have to leave school early because, again, there's not recognition and there's not programs and supports for students who have things that are different than the norm. And there's also a lot of bullying and a lot of social stigma for children who are outside the norm. Again, this is starting to change, particularly in the South, which is where I live. They're starting to have more and more acceptance, and they're starting to have more progress, but traditionally, this is how it is. And the United States is the most individualistic country in the world. Everything's about me, me, me in the United States. They called my generation in the 80s and the 90s the me generation, and that was when things were starting to get more and more individualistic. So children are part of nuclear families. That means they're considered to be part of parents, and if they have siblings, that's considered their family, and all the decisions are supposed to come through the parents, not the extended family, and the decisions are not generally supposed to be made based on what's good for society at large. In a school setting, of course, you can't always do that. There has to be some parameters just to keep order at a school and to have what students need and to have some structure. But the idea is that children should learn based on a family's values, and also based on the child's individual personality and the child's individual abilities. And this has kind of got an extreme in society in the United States. There's this idea that each child should have something tailored to their needs, which is a beautiful idea. It's beautiful. But in practice, it's hard. So which is better? The answer is both of these are not very good. We've gone so extreme in the United States that children who have significant problems, that it may include behavior problems, are included in classrooms, and there's this idea that from an individual standpoint, even what you might call negative character traits, things that are not good, like violence, behavior problems, cursing, even that has to be accepted because as an individual, that's what that child does. And it's a part of the child if the child has a disability. But in China and in all parts of Eastern Asia, parents with money often put their kids in private school, or even they send them overseas. That's not done as much anymore as it was a few years ago because of political reasons, geopolitical reasons, and so forth, and fear of COVID and safety and things like that. But it still often happens that parents will even send their children overseas because they don't feel like a communalistic education works, and it does it for many students. There are many students who are left out of that. The United States and some other Western countries are unique in that we really strive for individualism in education, and for every child to get an education. And it's something that we really should be proud of. I know we bash the education system a lot. God knows I'm critical of it, but there's at least this idea that every child should have an education that works for them. Now, that being said, the way that we're individualistic in education in the United States, to me, is very structurally unsound. What do I mean by that? Well, the idea of individualism in education is actually really old. If you read Little House on the Prairie, or you read some books that take place during that time, the 1800s, when free schools were beginning, there was this idea of the one-room schoolhouse. Of course, the cities had schools that had grade levels and different things like that. Students were grouped by age. But traditionally, in these rural areas, there would be one-room schoolhouses. When I taught in Northeast Tennessee, there were probably at least a dozen of these old schools that were no longer in use, that people talked about in the community because they attended these schools up to the mid-1900s because it was a rural community. And these were small schools. They would have usually fewer than 100 students, sometimes even fewer than that. And they would be extremely individualized. So students would be working on whatever level they were at. And it was very flexible. A lot of students, for example, would have to work on the farm. So when they came to school, they might be way ahead of their peers if they didn't have to work on the farm, and they could come to school regularly. But they might have missed several weeks of school or several months of school because of having to work, or illness was very common then. People would be out for illness, and so it was very common to have people around the same age doing very different things. You might have a child doing fractions while another child was learning to add, subtract, and if a child was especially good at something, then that child would be doing higher level work. And so, and there was a great teacher autonomy. There wasn't a whole lot of, this is what you have to do. In fact, in some places, there were not even standard. Teachers would do what they thought was right for the student. And I worked for a school district that was in a rural area where teachers had kind of that same model. Teachers were encouraged not to just use textbooks and not to do the same thing for every student. There was this idea of using data, including reading levels, in particular, in the field of reading. And they did something similar with math to find out where students are at and to meet them at that level. And teachers were encouraged to use a wide variety of resources. They were encouraged to have lots and lots of books. The school system actually created classroom libraries, which was where there were lots and lots of different books of different subjects in the classroom, and they were organized, and students could find something based on not only in their level, but on interest, because that was another thing that we worked towards, was interest. And assignments were also differentiated. Students usually had like a menu that they could choose from about how to show that they mastered this standard. And again, based on where the student was, the teacher could make that assignment a little bit harder, or could make it a little bit more basic if they needed to, but it was all based on the standards. And that school had amazing results. There was a partnership with the University of Tennessee, which I later worked with for my EDS and my doctorate. But that school district went way up. In some cases, in some schools, they doubled their reading test scores, and in some cases, in some schools, special education referrals went down in some cases, because students were getting what they need. They also had very robust intervention programs, but the intervention programs, again, were based on what student need. They were putting groups based on skill, not just level. It's a phenomenal thing when students have what they need on an individual level. The problem I see in schools today is that it's going the other way. So we have this idea of individualism, and it's an idea that across party lines is really touted. This idea that children are the future and that we have to do what's right for each child. And it might sound a little bit different, whether it's on the right political side of the aisle or it's on the left, but there's that idea there. But in practice, other priorities are becoming important in education. Other priorities are taking over, and there's two main things that are driving that. So the first is capitalism. So in many states and local districts, particularly urban districts that have lots of schools, and in really on the federal level, there are all these parameters now that limit teacher autonomy. So many times it's mandated that you have a specific curriculum, which is not necessarily bad. You need something to guide you. You need a guide to help you to reach your students. But you have to be on this page at this time with every child. They have pacing guides, and you have to be exactly where the same thing is, which is the opposite of individualism, because you're going to have kids who need different things at different levels. It's unrealistic to say that you won't have that at any grade level, no matter how well a teacher does or a school is. And there are all these companies that have all these programs that they sell. Now, in fairness, some of these programs are technically individualized, but it's usually based on technology, and it's usually limited. So there's for iReady and some of these other programs, there's this woman out there who says that she can teach children in 2 hours a day using AI. That's not going to work for every kid, and then there's multiple reasons why. First of all, technology, especially for young children, does not work as well as teachers. It just doesn't. And we can try to say that as much as we want to, and I feel like funding's part of this, because it's easier and it's often cheaper to put kids on a computer, but it just doesn't work as well. And there's research now that shows that it's actually very harmful for students' brains, and in some countries in Northern and Western Europe, they're actually limiting the amount of screen time children have. Also, when you do this, you're going to get just short snippets of text. Generally, they're selections, they're passages. That's not authentic reading, and it's not going to motivate students, and it's not going to give them enough practice. For students to really do well, particularly in reading, they need to practice reading for long periods of time. And the best way to do that is on things that you like and things that are around your level. And AI programs, I'm sorry, they don't do that. They don't give enough practice for students. And it may work better for some students, particularly gifted students, but we saw during COVID what life was like when school was entirely technological. I feel like there is a place for virtual learning and for virtual schools. In fact, I work for one part-time, high school, but that takes some maturity, and it also takes a specific type of learner who is able to self-direct. That's something that most students don't have, and we saw it during COVID. You think of how much learning loss occurred during COVID when we had this big experiment where everything was on computers. It doesn't work. Another issue is that even when there are pencil and paper programs, they're all the same for each student, and it's assumed that every student needs the same thing. And this is true even in intervention. So for example, you hear a lot about Ortho Gillingham and Wilson, and in some states and school systems, this is actually mandated that you use these programs and these programs only. And those programs may work for a certain group of learners who need decoding, but they ignore fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, and phonemic awareness. And then there are some programs that are just phonemic awareness that everyone's using. Phonemic awareness is easy for most kids. Most kids don't need that. So again, they're basing what every student gets the same thing. It's the opposite of individualism. The other thing that's influenced this is ideology. So in the United States right now, we have a lot of cultural tension. You hear the word culture war sometimes about what should be taught and what children should have access to. There's this fear among certain segments of the population that children are learning inappropriate things at school, and that so that there must be really big control over teaching, and particularly what teachers do. Teachers are not trusted to have good materials for children and to know what children need, because there's this fear that children will learn things that are not appropriate for them, or that particularly promote political or sexual views, or cultural views that are against what the parents that are advocating for this believe. There's really a lot of fear-mongering about teachers, and a lot of, in my opinion, disrespect about teachers and the belief that they can do what they need to do. And teachers aren't perfect. I've said this in many, many videos. Teachers aren't perfect and they need support. But the amount of support that they need is not telling you every 5 minutes what to do. It's providing resources, it's providing training. To individualize well, you need a lot of training. It's not something that just somebody who has 6 weeks of training can do, like some of these alternative certification programs. It takes a lot of experience, a lot of training. And it's messy, it's not easy, but it's worth it. And because of ideological reasons, schools are losing their classroom libraries. Schools are sometimes losing their big libraries. They're taking away books. And tied into this is the ideological idea that testing is important and that testing shows everything. It doesn't show everything. But there's this idea that you have to do things the way a test shows. So you have to give snippets of passages because that's what's on a test and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if a kid can't read fluently and struggles to do reading for assignments in high school or college because the test only has passages. So things like this are going on. And we're going in the very opposite direction that we need to be going as far as individualism in this manner. Another issue that comes up when we talk about individualism is rights. So typically you hear about two kinds of things in individualism in the United States when it comes to education. The first is a student's right. And there's actually a video out there of a child pepper spraying their teacher. That means that the child took pepper spray, which is meant to be used for self-defense. If you're in a dangerous situation, you're getting robbed, you're getting attacked, you can use pepper spray to hurt a teacher. It really harms the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and I'm sure other children in that classroom were also harmed. I don't know all the details with that. But people were actually defending the student because the teacher had taken the cell phone away. And there was this idea, well, the student has a right to a cell phone. That, to me, is an amazing argument. That is individualism run amok. This idea that your rights go above basic safety. And you'll hear about that. And people will say, oh, well, the teacher was bad to my child. And my child has the rights to have a nice teacher. The teacher doesn't pay enough attention to my child. My child has the rights to good grades. You hear that a lot. Well, my child did this work. It doesn't matter if the work's good. My child has the rights. So there's this idea of right. It's usually related to free speech or free expression. That the child has the right to do whatever they want to at the school. That is totally insane, and that is not sustainable. It's not. The second way that rights are often presented in education are rights of students with disabilities. So every student in the United States has rights, but the strongest rights, because of the law, the way the law is written, and because of the way the school is structured, the strongest rights are for students who have disabilities. And unlike in Eastern Asia and most of the world. Students who are disabled are not just physically disabled, and oftentimes the disabilities are not things that would be seen as disabilities in most of the world. Particularly when we talk about things like behavior disorder, that's considered a disability in the United States. Your child can't behave, they have something physically or psychologically wrong with them. That's becoming more and more of a thing. Children are being diagnosed with anxiety, with oppositional defiant disorder, with things like that. ADHD is other health impairment. Your child can't sit still. That is an unheard of thing in other countries, which again, many of those students would not be learning, which is not a good thing. It's a good thing that we have laws that protect these students. And learning disabilities, which again is not recognized in many countries, and people don't really understand this, but learning disabilities almost didn't make it into the Individualized Disability Education Act. It was almost not recognized as a category, which seems crazy today because that's what many students are under. And the only way many parents can get the individualization they need for their child is to diagnose with a disability. So I'm in all these mom groups, and whatever a parent asks about anything related to school, anything. My child doesn't like their teacher. My child's struggling socio-emotionally. My child just doesn't like school. My child's being bullied. Somebody in that thread, which is again his mom, says, well, your child needs to be evaluated for a disability, because that is seen as the only way to get individualization. It should not be that way. It shouldn't be that parents have to have their child tested or your child to be labeled as a disability. And the research shows that when children are labeled as disabled, and they could push through it with in a different way, if they could have tutoring or they could have intervention, and yet they're diagnosed as disabled, that this really, really harms your education, because suddenly there's lower expectations for your child. But again, because we've done such a poor job with individualization of all students, this is seen as the way to go. And so students with disabilities have a lot of rights, and that includes things like being included in a regular classroom. And many times students will be in classrooms even when they have behavior problems, because there's so many lawsuits, there's so much many legal issues about children with disabilities, and no school system wants to fight that. It's very expensive, it's very difficult. And there are attorneys out there who would literally fight for these children to be in regular classroom. And individualism in special education works when the child really needs it. Particularly students have severe disabilities. Most of the time, in most of the world, students with severe disabilities don't go to school, and they don't have much of a future, honestly. We do a very good job for that when the child gets what they need. When the child has teachers who are able to work with that student on goals and have the student have a vocation, it's amazing. But many times that's not happening, and that's partly because of funding, because special education, it really depends on the state and how much the state puts in, but it's generally recognized that students get about between 15% and 30% of the funding they need for special education. So students may have really high needs, and they don't get what they need for that, and they're just stuffed in a classroom. And it becomes this whole idea of right. And the other thing is that special education has largely become accommodation-based. And that's partly because there's so many students and such little funding. For special education to be done right, you need a lot of services for students. You need a lot of really good teachers working with these students to have them to meet high academic standards, and that's not really happening. So it's become largely accommodation-based. Kids don't have to do all the work. They don't have to sometimes even take tests that other students take, or they have everything read aloud to them, which that ends up being that the child doesn't learn how to read very well. Students with disabilities are seen as innocent. It's seen as not being their fault, which again is a very individualistic idea, that everything is based on the disability, based on the student's individual needs and the student's individual makeup, rather than based on a combination of environmental and genetic and nature-based factors. There's this idea that student as an individual, everything is based on the student's individual makeup rather than an combination of environmental and individual factors, which is usually what it is. And we even know that some of the children who are diagnosed with disabilities, it's because of things like not having a good educational background. Many times learning disabilities happen because students just don't get what they need when they're young. And that's part of what Response to Intervention was designed to prevent. But Response for Intervention is a whole other thing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about with that, that's a program to help students to catch up in math and reading at the lower grades. Phenomenal when it's done right. But again, it's often not done right. It's often these packaged programs and not what each student individually needs. So that's my opinion for what it's worth as a reading specialist and a career teacher. Is that individualism is great when it's done right, but we're not doing it right. And it's going to take a total overhaul of the education system to do it right. We're going to have to really change things for this to work and for individualism to be used in a way that's healthy for students, healthy for schools, and that gets students to where they need to be. And I don't see that happening. I see it going in the other direction, which is ironic for a country that values individualism so much. So that's my thoughts on it. What are your thoughts on it? It's a big country. There are lots of different things going on in different states. What do you see about individualism in your schools, and does it help or hurt, and what could make it better? What could honor individualism while also giving students what they need and having the structure and support that students need, and the environment students need, the learning environment all students need to learn. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much, and until next time, keep learning.